Mark Cuban went into Pablo Torre's studio down 3-0, with Pablo having all of the momentum and came out with a decisive victory. And let's play a clip that shows one reason why Mark was able to come out with the win.
Fact that wasn't over $2 billion as a valuation was after that roughly $300 million infusion came in.
You're missing the point because you're trying to just drive it just the one thing you know. Okay, so
I'm talking about like sports washing, and I think you're trying to talk about lots of other things.
No, you're not letting me finish.
Please, please.
All right, so
Exactly. Pablo was too eager to get his points across when they've already come across. Everybody already knows the points that Pablo has made, and Mark is aware of them. Pablo needed to let Mark speak more. It would actually work to his advantage, but time and again, Pablo comes across as too eager to work against what Mark is saying, and he's actually guilty of something that Mark was guilty of, which is trying to talk over the other person instead of letting them make their point. You have to let Mark make his point. And with Pablo's evidence, it's only inevitably going to work in his favor. But instead, he was so eager to recite many of the points that he's already made that he was working against himself. So let's go through a few more clips. And one other thing before we get started. Pablo takes more of an angle, and we've seen this before, where he's looking at this more dramatically, and he needs to look at it more in a sterile way, looking at it very cold, looking at what exactly can we prove, because that's really what Mark Cuban is going towards. Is like, look, I can defend against your points because I'm just going to say I don't know, or it could have been anything, it could have been this. That's very hard to counter. So, what Pablo needs to do is emphasize his strong points and not get caught in these arguments where you're really not going to be able to have Mark in a corner, because it's a place where it's uncornerable. You're not going to be able to get him into a place where it's like you are definitively wrong now. But there are pieces of evidence that Pablo has that work in his favor that he's really not taking advantage of here. He does keep at Mark, so he definitely doesn't let Mark off in the traditional way. Where he lets Mark off is where he talks over him and he gives him a moment of reprieve and the ability to reset. And we've seen this in the previous recording with Mark Cuban. This was a golden opportunity. You have Mark Cuban one-on-one in your studio, and you have to let him talk. If this was one of those meeting recorders where we look at who does most of the talking, Pablo should have done about 25% of the talking here. You want to let Mark Cuban go on because it's only going to work in your favor. But we saw all too often that Pablo was overly eager to get his point across. Again, Pablo, everybody already knows your points. So we want to let Mark talk as much as possible because he is in a weak position. So the more he talks, the more likely there's going to be a mistake. But that's not how this podcast played out. So let's go ahead and play a few different clips, and we will start at 22:30.
Who maybe isn't as smart as he thought he was.
I don't know or care. All I know.
But I guess the point is there can be some mixture, as always, of cleverness and
there
incompetence.
can be a lot of mixtures of a lot of things, but you don't have proof one way or the other.
Hold on. We're going to get there. The question here I asked you was, sir, why did they never announce this deal at all? And so we're now...
So Mark comes back to that several times, and he actually does a good job of making his point that, hey, you don't have any proof. Now, Pablo again alludes to the fact that he's holding back information, and we've seen that this is a tactic of Pablo's, is that I'm not going to release everything. So here he's not giving anything away that he has coming in another episode. And I didn't think that Pablo would have an episode before. I think it's next week we have the NBA's opening tip-off. I thought there would be a podcast release on the tip-off, but here we had Mark Cuban in New York. He agrees to come in studio. And by the way, I love the one-on-one format. You just can't beat it when you have a podcast where you have two opposing points of view. They don't necessarily have to be contentious, but just two people that are going in the opposite direction that are face-to-face and meeting head-on. So you have this format. It's really nice. but I don't think Pablo didn't take advantage of it here. So let's go ahead and play another clip from 4155.
$8 million.
It is. Yeah.
You thought it was 28. You didn't know it was 48, right?
I didn't have the evidence that I have now for the $20 million.
Right. So now you're backtracking to try to make those numbers fill, right? But that's not the point.
No.
The point is when you went in episode 1, and you thought it was $28 million.
It is on the endorsement deal, $28 million.
Okay, that's not where I'm going.
You got the paperwork.
Right, you got the paperwork, right?
So this was a good point by Mark, and he really has him here in the sense that, hey, look, in this episode 1, you're saying that the $50 million was for $28 million. And really here, Mark is using Pablo holding back information against him to appear to have a stronger point. Now, later it comes out that there's the $20 million in stock options. Pablo's holding this back, and he gets to this in a second. In fact, let's go ahead and look at this clip, because here Pablo states that Pablo alludes to the fact that he really did have this. He just wasn't releasing it at the time of the podcast.
Episode 1.
No. So
when all this started.
In episode 1, it was 28. I had not mentioned the 20.
Because you didn't know about it at the time.
I could not report it, absolutely.
Besides
okay, so there you see a difference, right? Mark saying you don't know it, and then Pablo stating I couldn't report it at the time. So there is Pablo holding this back. Mark is using this to make a point in his favor, and it does come across well for Mark. Mark is trying to get him on that you didn't know this. Pablo is trying to say, without explicitly stating that I did know this, I just wasn't saying it at the time. So there's Mark making a point, but it is a point, right? Mark's trying to say here that, hey, you're just looking for anything, and you're stating that, okay, there was $28 million and it was covered by the 50. And Mark is saying, well, now you're saying that there's more, and now it all lines up, and you didn't know this at the time. And I'm quite sure. I am quite sure that Pablo did know at the time, but he wasn't. Of course, we know that he's been drip feeding content. So he's done 7 months of research. This isn't all coming because he's in a furious weekend research session, but Mark is using this in his favor, and it comes across well. All right, so let's go to 44 minutes and 20 seconds in.
First came on. I don't care if Steve is guilty or not, right? It's better for the Mavericks if he is, right? My issue is when you came out with podcast 1, you had nothing.
That's not true.
It's very true.
That's not
right.
true.
And you tied the things you tried.
All right, so that was a really key point in this whole podcast, is Mark stating you had nothing. And this again is Mark. I don't know if this is strategically, but he's using Pablo withholding information against him to make Pablo appear like he was more ignorant than he was. And so it's a nice move by Mark. Pablo counters this and says that's not true. And so there we see really a very interesting moment in this podcast recording. All right, so let's go to 46 minutes and 20 seconds in.
No. You knew what was at stake for Ballmer. You knew
100%. We made it very clear.
Right, but you said 50 in, 28 out.
Yes.
That looks like
in
you're
a deal
trying.
that never got announced. Of course,
Put aside
the dots were connected by the 7 sources that I have.
If the sources, okay,
I'm just saying we can.
Why was the money not?
Disagree that
any
sources are
Mark,
meaningful.
even a criminal would know. Pay the 50. If you're getting the 50 to keep this guy happy for a circumvention that he needs for his business,
Sure.
Make sure he gets paid on time at least the first
I
time.
should make clear.
The point I wanted to make here is that Mark is emphasizing you have the $50 million in and the $28 million out, and that's not lining up. So let's go on to 48 minutes and 20 seconds in, where they talk about the auditor resigning.
I know.
I just want to list what it is.
Right, but here's what it is. Right.
Pick whatever you want.
KPMG resigned as the company's independent auditor. So while on one hand, that's a red flag, right?
The independent auditor was
but they didn't give why. Yeah, they didn't say.
So there is just a mild interruption, but here's another point where I'd like Pablo just to let Mark keep talking, because he actually concedes that this is a red flag. This is rare for Mark. He rarely is it throughout this whole back and forth with Pablo. He has rarely conceded anything. Here we have one of those times, and then Pablo's interjecting right here, but he continues on. So we'll keep playing the clip.
right? And that's
Why do
critical.
you think, in retrospect, they might have done that?
Yeah, because they couldn't, because Joe Sandberg was doing all these round trip deals and they couldn't.
The company was in default and
It
otherwise
wasn't even that
facing
that
litigation
it wasn't
and
that they were in
probes by
default,
the
right?
government.
They couldn't confirm all the.
It was fish.
So there you heard more of Pablo talking over Mark. Let's go to 49 minutes and 25 seconds in.
It doesn't really say anything.
The company is in default, I believe. Honestly, there's some stuff on here that's pretty good.
Yeah, I read this in the SEC.
Yeah. The company is in default.
So look, I get your point. That
so
why would somebody invest in a company that shows you this?
Litigation, 8.7 million in damages alleged by
Right. So
Nanobank.
there must be some ancillary thing,
claims
right?
of breach of loan.
Pablo continues to talk over him here. Mark stating again, he was conceding, I get your point. So this is where you go in on it. This is where you start to emphasize and you focus in and you don't let up. Here you just have Pablo adding more, talking more through this. Let Mark keep talking. We want Mark to be able to get out his point. One, it's just fair that you have someone talking. If one person is talking over the other, it doesn't really come across as fair. And depending on the circumstances, it's not going to make it look like you, to simplify this, you won the argument. Here, we want to let Mark make his point. He's in New York, he's in studio. Let Mark talk and then counter him. And while you have him here, while he's saying that this is a red flag and that you have a point, let him keep going on that. Don't stop him until he stops. So let's go to 55 minutes and 20 seconds in.
That was what he saw.
But to your point, right? Now let's think this through.
Please.
Right. There were other investors because we got to see the
They
pitches.
were all previously.
The point is, right? The point is those other two investors that invested around the same time as Dennis Wong, right? They, as best I can remember, so they also said, you know what? I like what I'm seeing in this pivot.
Okay, so this was a very disingenuous two other investors because those two other investors were both a part of Aspiration. And Pablo says who they are here. It's Joe Sandberg, and I can't remember his name.
But I do need to just take a quick beat here to clarify something that we reported previously on the show. When it comes to the identities of the only other investors, the two other entities who gave Aspiration money in December 2022 in that same Series C5 round, having been presented with that same exact set of disclosures in all of their bleakness as Clippers co-owner Dennis Wong. Because one of those two investors was Aspiration board member Ibrahim Al-Husseini, the same guy who pleaded guilty to wire fraud in March 2025, the same guy who was the alleged co-conspirator of Aspiration co-founder Joe Sandberg. And the other investor was, yes, Joe Sandberg himself.
All right, so there, Mark stating that there are other investors. That makes it sound like other people were looking to buy in. No, this is just Joe Sandberg, and I can't forget the other guy's name, but they were both a part of Aspiration already. Let's go ahead and go to 55. We're past 55:20. 57 minutes in, where we start to talk about Dennis Wong.
Company in default, facing those problems as aforementioned. Why do you think he put in that little money for that little equity?
Maybe to make his daughter happy. His daughter worked there, right? Maybe to keep him alive. Maybe to give him one more month. Maybe they said,
you think that I would save the balance sheets of Aspiration $2 million? And by the way, lots of people came in and out of the company. I'm not here to
This is so weak by Mark. And he made this point on the Road Trippin' podcast with Richard Jefferson to try to explain away Dennis Wong investing in Aspiration at this point in time for this just under $2 million. Pablo starts talking here. Let Mark keep going. Let him keep going with this bridge loan, bridge investment theory that he wants to float out, because to make his daughter to save his daughter or whatever it was, Dennis Wong could have paid his daughter outright. He didn't have to have this money flow through Aspiration. Let's go ahead and play this one more time because it's just a really bad theory from Mark.
Maybe they said,
think that I would save the company in default, facing those problems as aforementioned. Why do you think he put in that little money for that little equity?
Maybe to make his daughter happy. His daughter worked there, right? Maybe to keep.
So Mark is shrugging his shoulders at this point, maybe to make his daughter happy. That's the best you could come up with. Now, if you're here, this is a time to focus in on this, right? Because this is Mark uh, putting a very weak theory out there. So focus here. Go in here, talk about this at length, and let him continue to explain this.
Keep them alive, maybe to give them one more month. Maybe they
You
said
think that I would save the balance sheets of Aspiration 2 million? And by the way, lots of people came in and out of the company. I'm not here to.
So Pablo started to do this, and then he continued talking. Leave this to Mark. Keep going on it. Don't talk over it. But let's go to 59 minutes and 35 seconds in.
After months of delay.
after months of
I
delay.
asked you the question, why would he put in 1.99 specifically? And your only response was maybe he wanted to save the company, which doesn't happen.
No,
Maybe he wanted to make his daughter happy. By the way, his daughter, according to people who worked with her, quote, she 100% knew that the company was a sinking ship, end quote. Kawhi got paid 1.75 the day they laid off 20% of the staff.
Yeah, that's because they were pivoting. Of course, you're going to lay off staff. Look, you're trying to put everything in. Joe Sandberg is his own unique entity.
So what's happening here is Pablo did come back to this, and he did focus in on it, but he kept going. He kept talking about it, and he gave Mark a chance to have basically like a throwaway line, and then continue on, reset, and continue on. Let Mark answer the question. Don't continue to add to it, because otherwise that's an escape. And here's a point where Mark is putting out a very weak theory. So they continue on, and here we have at the end we have some interesting questions from Pablo. And one of them gets at something that he might bring up later, because he made a point to ask Mark Cuban over and over again. So one interesting part was 1 hour and 23 minutes in, 55 seconds after the 23 minutes, uh, Pablo asked Mark about the Dirk Nowitzki contract and whether or not the Mavs circumvented the salary cap, to which Mark unequivocally states no. But then this leads to a very interesting development, and let's just go ahead and play the clip.
Serves, the Rangers. That's
I
right.
know that.
Dennis Wong serves on the Executive Advisory Council of the George W. Bush Presidential Center.
I did not know that.
Dennis Wong's on the Board of Trustees of the Dallas Museum of Art.
Let's actually go a little bit further ahead to where this started, because here
really good. But there is something that I realized that you've not volunteered with me in these back and forths that we've had, and I wonder if you know what it is now that I've built up to this question.
I have no idea.
It turns out that Dennis Wong lives in Dallas.
Oh, he does.
It also turns
that would have been a good time to have the camera on Mark Cuban and not a document. You want to see his reaction. So when you have this pivotal moment where you're bringing up something that, hey, Dennis Wong is on all of these same committees, associations, whatever, as you are, that's a really good time to have the reaction for Mark Cuban. So show him. Instead, we see a document, and then we see Pablo. So here we have a mistake from the cameraman.
Out that Dennis Wong is involved with every one of those exact same organizations that you are, that I just mentioned.
Really?
Dennis Wong also owns a major league baseball team based in Texas called the Texas Rangers. He's a first face listed on the website's ownership group page. Dennis Wong serves, he owns the Rangers.
So this goes on where Pablo continues to talk about, well, you're on the same groups, associations, committees. And so that's a very interesting fact that comes out. And we do see Pablo ask Mark repeatedly, did you know about this? What have you, when have you talked to Dennis Wong, etc.? And then Mark states that he has talked to Dennis Wong, and it was, I think it was at a Mavericks game, and he hadn't spoke with him at any NBA Board of Governors conferences, even though apparently at the last one, Dennis Wong showed up. So this was not as good an episode as I thought it would be. In multiple ways. It actually wasn't as entertaining as I thought it would be, but it also, here we didn't have Pablo advancing. And that's why I think it's an easy win for Mark Cuban, is just that Pablo moved laterally with all of the momentum that he had. There should have been at least an incremental step forward, but he didn't really, Mark Cuban presented well here. He didn't get mad despite the fact that Pablo was interrupting him continuously throughout the back and forth. And I think that's, to Mark, for Mark Cuban, that's a plus because it makes it really easy not to answer any difficult questions when you're constantly interrupted. And the other part of this is that Pablo did ask, there were some good questions that Pablo came up with, but he talked right through them. And so what you had here was, it was interesting. It was definitely worth the watch. I will link to it in the description. But this was a decisive win for Mark Cuban. He came across well. He made some good points. There was one other point here. Oh, Mark makes a good point when he says that Joe Sandberg had no intention of ever paying the money. So when you see this large Kawhi contract that is 4 times the combined size of the contracts for the uh, Drake and Robert Downey Jr. and the other celebrities, that it could have been just that. Hey, he knows that he's not going to pay him anyway, so why not make this contract as big as it was? So I think that's one of the points that Mark was making. I think also there was one other thing. There was one other part that I just remembered and I forgot. But there were some interesting points in this podcast, but it wasn't nearly as good as it could have been, and that's in part because Pablo was talking too much throughout this. Here would be a great opportunity to let Mark Cuban talk more. We see mostly from Mark with tweets. Of course, he had the one podcast that he recorded with Pablo Torre, but most of it is written. So here we get him talking through it. You'd like to hear more from him, and especially strategically, if you're Pablo, if Mark is talking and working through these theories on his own, then we can seal him in these points that he's making, and then you can come back later with this additional evidence that we all know that you still have. So this was my takeaway from the podcast as I was listening. Again, I don't think. By the way, I don't think that there is anything here for Mark. Right? If you're looking at what would be salary cap circumvention, this looks exactly like how you would circumvent the salary cap, but we don't have the tangible exact evidence. There's no video evidence of Kawhi Leonard, and we have Steve Ballmer telling Kawhi, "Hey, look, we'll pay you through the rest. Just go through aspiration. We'll make sure you get paid." There's not that, and that's in part what Mark Cuban is relying on. Is like, you don't have this, but we do have a lot. We have some very abnormal transactions happening, and so that is what Pablo is bringing out. There is going to be more to come. You can tell that just by the way that Pablo is talking. There were some very interesting points here. We've gone over those now. I'll link to the video in the description. And I do expect, so what I'm thinking is that Pablo is going to have another podcast for opening night. That seems to be a really good date to have another podcast. And the other the other part of this story is whether or not this can continue on, right? Like, how long can you continue with this story? Is this something that can be an ongoing news cycle that Pablo is generating single-handedly? Is he going to be able to do this throughout the season? Are people still going to remain interested? That's going to depend on how good of evidence he has going forward. But I think on NBA opening night, it would make a lot of sense to have some really compelling evidence come out then. But we know that Pablo has more. But in this episode, Mark Cuban came across well. He did a good job, and he was there. He was right there to answer all of the questions Pablo had. So I give credit to Mark Cuban on this one. He came across well. He put forth some other good theories. Again, it's not like he had any he had any he didn't have really anything that compelling, but he was able to defend against some of the assertions and the evidence that Pablo had. So that's a win for Mark Cuban. The win for the NBA and the defense of this story, or the defense of the Clippers scandal, is anything that neutralizes this, because they don't have to prove that this wasn't salary cap circumvention. all they have to do is make this more unclear, to muddy the waters and just make this more uncertain and or confusing, and that's going to be a win for anybody that wants to defend Steve Ballmer and the Clippers. And so that's what happened here. Although Pablo did have a few points, ultimately Mark Cuban comes away with the victory.